Right, we'll get started then. So just to confirm, we'll stop recording at the point of the question and answers at the end. So if anyone does want to come on camera to talk, you won't be recorded and you won't be uploaded to our YouTube channel. But as I said previously, please do use the Q&A function as part of Teams. So apologies to anyone who is up to speed on local nature recovery strategies or were in the previous webinar, but it is worthwhile, given this webinar is open to all, to sort of recap what local nature recovery strategies are as a policy. So stemming from the Environment Act, there are a number of policies relating to the natural environment and nature recovery, and all of them are sort of heavily entwined. But local nature recovery strategies is the cornerstone of them all, really, and it's essentially that's because they are intended to drive the funding mechanisms for where nature recovery is best to take place across England. So they are a new system of spatial strategies, so they will be mapping locations for nature recovery, and they are really a once in a generation opportunity to focus on nature recovery from a policy perspective. They've got a level of teeth which previous biodiversity related policies, particularly around improving biodiversity and nature recovery, have lacked. So the overriding purpose of these is to support national nature recovery across England and to support planning authorities to I guess incorporate nature and nature recovery within their decision making, and particularly around nature recovery objectives. We have a national suite of nature recovery objectives stemming from the 25-year plan and other national policies. And what nature recovery strategies will do is essentially create a tool to help us target local action within the local context so that we can contribute to those national targets in a way that is meaningful and beneficial to Hull and East Yorkshire, rather than sort of making a square peg fit a round hole sometimes and taking the sort of broad brush approach from a national perspective and trying to make it fit a local perspective. It's the other way around. And one of the big questions I suppose we always get when we talk about nature recovery or any sort of nature friendly policy is how is it going to be paid for? And this is one of the things that makes local nature recovery strategies very different from previous policies, in that, yes, there is this sort of traditional subsidy approach available from the public purse, but also through the biodiversity net gain agenda, which has been live for a couple of weeks now, came in on February the 12th as legislation. The biodiversity net gain agenda will drive private investment into funding nature recovery. So developments which cause loss or degradation of habitats will now have to either on-site or off-site contribute to the enhancement or creation of new habitats, plus 10% of the damage that was originally caused. So we're still in the rollout phase of biodiversity net gain. It's brand new policy being implemented right now. It's going to be further extended in April to smaller developments, but biodiversity net gain has a potential to funnel money into nature recovery, and what the local nature recovery strategies will do is identify where that is best placed to take place. So it's not the case that nature recovery strategies will tell planning authorities or developers where biodiversity net gain has to occur, but it will try and steer them into delivering it in the most impactful locations across England and from our perspective across Hull and East Yorkshire. And all of this contributes to the national targets through the 25-year plan and others, and the 30 by 30 target, which is often touted as the 30% of land being well managed for nature by 2030. And in terms of the coverage of local nature recovery strategies, they are technically, from a statutory perspective, terrestrial strategies. They don't include the marine environment. They go down to mean low tide. But as a coastal county, we made a decision very early, and we are sticking to it, to include the marine environment within the Hull and East Yorkshire local nature recovery strategy. Now, that has pros and cons. One of the pros being that because it's non-statutory, it means that we can consider it how we think is best to consider it. It's not constrained by the regulation and guidance that the rest of the local nature recovery strategy is. The con is that there aren't any sort of specific or explicit funding mechanisms currently for marine nature recovery. So we have to think quite carefully around how we represent marine nature recovery within the LNRS in a way which we can actually have some tangible, pardon me, tangible objectives to try and achieve. And then lastly, from a national perspective, the rationale and philosophy of this is that there'll be no overlaps and no gaps. So one of the key deliverables within the local nature recovery strategy will be a nature recovery network map. So within Hull and East Yorkshire, we will map land where we think nature recovery, or evidence suggests nature recovery is best placed to take to be implemented, and that is where funding will be steered through BNG. The vision from a national perspective is that all of the other 47 responsible authorities developing LNRSs will also have their nature recovery network maps, and they will effectively slot together like a jigsaw to create a national nature recovery network. So it goes without saying that we're working very closely with our neighbours to make sure that that takes place. We're in a fairly fortunate position in that most of our physical border is with a single neighbour in North Yorkshire, so we're working very closely with them to ensure that our respective nature recovery networks complement one another. But we are also in regular contact with South Yorkshire and Greater Lincolnshire as well. So the process for nature recovery strategies in the long term follows this table that we've got on what's on the right hand side of my screen. I assume it is on yours as well. So we're in the preparation phase at the moment. We'll be publishing in 2025. And then that's when the work starts, really. We start taking action. And one of the sort of unique things about this strategy, I suppose, compared to previous policies, is that the Secretary of State will decide a time period in which we will have to review progress, report on progress, and that is our responsibility as the responsible authority, Striding Council, and then republish after we update it. So it will be an ever-evolving strategy. We don't know how often we're going to have to do that. All we know is that it will be between every 3 and 10 years. So depending on Secretary of State's view, it could be very soon, or it could be further down the line. So in terms of what local nature recovery strategies are going to be, as a minimum, from a legal perspective, we have to identify a statement of biodiversity priorities for Hull and East Yorkshire. We have to map what are termed the most important areas for nature. Those are predefined, so essentially those are sites which have a designation in place on them. So anything from a designated local wildlife site up to international designations like Ramsar, they will be mapped as existing sites of importance. And then the really important part, and where most of the work comes in, is mapping the areas which could become important in the future, and looking at how we incorporate the Lawtonian principles of bigger, better, and more connected. So we have these important sites, these existing designated sites. How do we make them better? How do we connect them? And how do we make the land connecting them of a high ecological value? But with this, it's also worth considering what LNRSs are not going to be. I think everyone involved and everyone who's sort of interested in nature conservation, if you use the phrase nature recovery strategy, everyone will have an idea as to what that should be in their own mind. But from a statutory perspective, LNRSs are very fairly well defined in what they are and what they're not. So the local nature recovery strategy won't go down to the sort of granular level whereby they are giving specific details on delivery plans for specific projects. There will be a tool to help identify where projects and where actions are best placed to occur. The delivery plan will really be down to whoever is carrying out the nature recovery, any specific nature recovery project. They won't automatically result in protection or designation. I think that's a really important message, because the nature of our land mass, we're predominantly an agricultural area. It's important the landowners understand that being within the nature recovery network won't have anything forced upon them from a designation or protection perspective. It will simply open up opportunities to fund nature recovery action if they're inclined to carry it out. But on the flip side, if we do have people, and hopefully we do, who want to carry out nature recovery action, the LNRS won't replace any of the existing requirements that are in place around planning permission or consideration for historic monuments, the historic environment, access routes, etc. So all of the current legislation designation policies that are in place will remain in place. And then the last one is a particularly important point, is that they're non-binding. The rationale, I suppose, of local nature recovery strategies from the government are that they should be the catalyst for collaboration across the region in regards to nature recovery. So as a responsible authority, we will be, we being East Riding of Yorkshire Council, developing, monitoring and reporting on the progress of the LNRS, but the actual nature recovery action itself will be a collaborative effort across the region. And this is why we're working quite hard, or very hard, to engage with people and just inform, understand what people think, understand what priorities people have, because nature recovery is not going to happen without residents, businesses, landowners, land managers across East Yorkshire buying in and building momentum towards nature recovery. So I apologise to anyone who's seen these slides before, but I think it is useful to just recap what the policy is. So I'm going to start with handing over to Alice from the Hull and East Yorkshire Local Nature Partnership. Hull and East Yorkshire Local Nature Partnership are a key organisation who sit on the steering group for the whole LNRS project, and they're an incredibly important development partner and will be an incredibly important delivery partner when we get to that point. So Alice is just going to introduce the LNP and the role of the LNP in LNRS. So if it's okay to you, Alice, I'll hand over and you can just tell me when you want me to click.
Great, thanks so much, John. So yeah, just that first slide would be great. So good evening, everyone. Really nice to join you this evening. And yeah, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the Hull and East Yorkshire Local Nature Partnership. So it was formed in 2012 and it achieved formal government status as one of the 47 LNPs across England. The primary goal of the LNP is to change how we work with the natural environment and demonstrate its inherent benefits to both people and the economy. So through protecting and enhancing our precious natural habitats, we're not only benefiting wildlife, but also human health and local businesses too. We bring together interested groups and organisations across the public, private, community and voluntary sectors to share knowledge and skills, as well as shedding light on existing projects to support nature recovery in the area. Here you can see on this slide some of the Hay LNP board members, illustrating the breadth of the partnership working across different sectors, including education, environmental services, farming, public health, although it's not shown there, and community engagement. The existing Hay LNP network is well placed to support strategic partnership working throughout the development of the LNRS, drawing on valuable input from diverse communities across Hull and East Riding. Next slide, please, John. So here you can see a map of the East Riding of Yorkshire and Hull, and you may have heard the term natural capital before, which refers to the elements of nature that add value to society. So I'll just pick out one example that you can see there, though it's very tiny. You can see Spurn Peninsula, which is both a natural flood defence for the Humber ports as well as an important site for migratory birds, attracting thousands of visitors per year, so supporting local business, trade and tourism. So by demonstrating the economic value of the natural world, people are more likely to treat it with greater respect and develop a deeper understanding of its long-term worth for future generations. So rather than deplete our natural resources, by investing in nature recovery, we can continue to live more sustainably and healthily. Here you can also see just some of the natural assets within Hull and East Riding, which through the successful delivery of an LNRS will continue to thrive. This will in turn support vital societal services, including food production, climate change mitigation and adaptation, tourism, business investment, health and well-being. And within LNRS, these can be recognised as co-benefits of restoring and enhancing local habitats for nature. Next slide, please, John. So if you want to find out any more about the Hay LNP, you can visit the council website. There's just that first link there. And if you want to be added to our mailing list, you can either email Matthew Millington, or myself. We've put both of our email addresses on there. So yeah, that was just a quick whistle-stop tour through the Hay LNP, but we can take any questions later on. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Alice. Given that that's a sort of natural break in the presentation, Emily, I just wonder if there are any questions in the Q&A in terms of that first part about what LNRSs are. It might be a good point to actually address them now rather than waiting until the end.
Yeah, of course. So we've got one question asking about whether the Marine Nature Recovery Programme is an integrated effort with North Yorkshire.
Yes, so the marine element is being led by the Yorkshire Marine Nature Partnership, who spans the entire Yorkshire coast. So a lot of what I'm about to go into is the outcome of their engagement as well. So the marine element does cover both sides. When it comes to local nature recovery strategy itself, it will be for East Yorkshire, and we've defined the marine environment as 1 kilometre inland, or the marine and coastal environment, sorry, as 1 kilometre inland to 12 nautical miles out. So I'll show a map in a little bit. They'll show a very artificial boundary, but again, as part of that cross-border integration and collaboration as we're developing it, we should, and the aim is certainly to have a collaborative and I guess an approach to marine nature recovery which is complementary. So it probably make a bit more sense when we get onto the maps, but in short, yes, the Yorkshire Marine Nature Partnership is leading on both sides. So the bulk of the work to date on local nature recovery, I guess, or the strategy itself has flipped into, I guess, the technical side and then the engagement side. The engagement side is where we've started to have outputs, and that's by design because we want those outputs to then feed into the technical development of the LNRS itself. So the bulk of the update today is going to be focused on the outcomes of engagement. These are very much headlines, primarily because we worked with partners and consultants to support us with this, and we're still waiting the full write-ups of the detail, but we have got the sort of headline from both the surveys and the workshops that we've carried out. So you may recall, if you attended the first webinar, that we were in the midst of promoting the surveys which were open at that time, and the farm and land manager workshops which we were promoting. So across the autumn, we put a lot of time and effort into comms and engagement to try and maximise engagement with those surveys in particular. And I think we did fairly well. We were operating in a very tight timeline, but we managed to land in the BBC News, Yorkshire Post, and a lot of the participants in our land manager and farmer workshops in particular seemed to pick up on the workshops via the more traditional print press. But we also did invest in paid for advertising through social media. We attended various regional events, both nature focused and non-nature focused, and we relied quite heavily on partner communication channels, so organisations like the NFU, the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, the Countryside Land Management Association supported us with lots of comms to their membership, which was gratefully received. And the webinar that we ran towards the end of the year, it sold out in the sense of, sold meaning free, but all tickets were taken, and we had 58 attendees in that one. We ran workshops specifically for the agricultural sector, and I think it's probably worth explaining why we felt the need to do that. Nature recovery is heavily dependent upon those who manage and own land, so we can try and influence nature recovery at a landscape level. East Riding of Yorkshire, or Hull and East Yorkshire, is predominantly agricultural in terms of the land use. So in this region in particular, engagement with the people and the businesses that predominantly manage the land is critically important to the success of our LNRS. So we ran 6 farmer workshops ourselves, and then Yorkshire Wildlife Trust very kindly hosted a 7th one, and we also had a land manager specific survey, which was similar to the general audience survey that some of you may have participated in, and some of you may have participated in the farmer survey, in which case, thanks to everyone who did. The questions were very similar, but there were a couple of different ones for the land managers specific to their role in or potential role in nature recovery. So across the land manager engagement workshops, we had 106 representatives, which we're quite happy with. Not only was it in the run up to Christmas, it was also getting to the point where priorities were starting to, or I guess time within those individuals from that sector were starting to be dominated by the weather. It was the start of the wet period that's never really ended. So the fact that we managed to get so many willing to come along to our events was really, really positive. We've also run a workshop only a couple of weeks ago for Hull City Council and East Riding of Yorkshire Parish Council councillors. So we had ward councillors from Hull and parish councillors from East Riding, and again, we had a very positive level of engagement there. That was an online workshop with our consultant partners. And then we've run our surveys, which many of you may have been involved with. So we've run 3 surveys to date. One, as I touched on earlier, specific to the farmer and land management sector. One for as a sort of catch-all for the general public, for anyone who wanted to respond on the behalf of a business, on the behalf of a group, whether that's an environmental group or otherwise. And we, because of the way that we structured the project team and the marine and coastal side being led by the Yorkshire Marine Nature Partnership, which spans both North and East Yorkshire coastlines, we ran a separate survey for that stream. And that wasn't because we see it as being something separate or something different. It was just we had some very specific questions we wanted to ask around the marine and coastal environment. So we had 336 responses to the coastal and marine survey, and that is across both counties. Sorry, it's not easy and north, it should be east and north. And we had 477 responses to the general Hull and East Yorkshire Local Nature Recovery Strategy survey. And these are all Host History Commonplace page, which you've used to book on today. And that page has got 718 subscribers, so 718 people who get updates whenever we put them on there, and has just over 5,000 visitors. As far as, I suppose, a proportion of the population goes, these numbers are obviously fairly small. They are in line with what other responsible authorities are getting from their engagement for local nature recovery strategies, based upon feedback we've had from Natural England. So I think our message here is that there's more to do, but that this is a sort of national trend that we're seeing. So we're not going to ease up on engagement. It's just the purpose of the engagement going forward is going to sort of change, I guess, in that we are at a point within the development timeline now where the information we're seeking to get from our engagement activities will be used maybe slightly differently than the information we've had to date, because we now at the point where we have to start using this information to make decisions, and we can't go back and redo work based upon feedback further down the line. So in terms of the messages that we got, and this is the interesting stuff, I suppose, from the Marine and Coastal survey, generally across both surveys, the general trends were very similar, which in itself is quite interesting. But the majority of respondents to the Marine and Coast survey are 45 plus in terms of age, and they lived in the area. Most people were equally interested in both county stretches of coastline, not just east or not just north. And then, interestingly and quite tellingly, I think, most of the respondents were involved in some form of environmental activity, although a large proportion weren't. The majority were. So I guess what we can take from that is that probably indicates that the people responding to this are relatively well informed when it comes to the natural environment around the marine and coast. But it also means that the bulk of the respondents are maybe the kind of people who would naturally be responding to this rather than the general public, and that there's more work for us to do in regards to reaching people who aren't actively engaged in natural environment issues. So the sort of big headline question as part of this survey was to what extent are you concerned about decline of biodiversity across Yorkshire's coastal environments? And as you can see from the chart there, the vast majority are. Only 1% responded, but not at all. So 99% of respondents are, at least to some degree, concerned around the decline of biodiversity across the coastline. And then we got into some sort of more detailed questions. Now, one piece of feedback we've had, and again, it's across the country, is the idea of prioritising habitats and species is something that people responding to the surveys have felt slightly uncomfortable with. But because the structure of LNRS requires prioritisation, it is something that we do have to do. It's not the case that this is a pure popularity contest and it's the things that came out top will automatically be an LNRS. The way that we will use this data is as part of a wider set of criteria to establish what our biodiversity priorities are going to be. So just a few sort of couple more key highlights, I guess. So question 3 within the survey was focused on why the marine environment was important to people, and as you can see, it's got a relatively even split between a number of different topics. But the biodiversity question, which had 25%, so a quarter of people, it was because of the biodiversity of the area, the diversity of species and habitats. But then you've also got things like nutrients, the visitor economy in green there as 11%, and then even a higher percentage there for around culture and heritage, which I think is particularly interesting. But again, if we go back to the first question where it indicated the majority of people responding to this are to some degree involved in coastal activities, we are likely referring to a fairly well-informed audience. And then in terms of species and habitats, this task was essentially a click and drag task where we pre-populated the habitat types and people would rank them. And the winners, if you like, the top 3 species assemblages that came out were seabirds, which we would have expected. And then maybe a bit more surprisingly were the smaller fish species and the marine plants. We expected it to be cetaceans, marine mammals, pinnipeds, that kind of thing, the seals, but smaller fish species and marine plants did come out quite high or very high. And from a habitats perspective, it was coastal grasslands and slopes, the sediment shoreline, and salt marsh and saline lagoons, which again is interesting, bearing in mind this does cover both counties' coastlines, but from an East Yorkshire perspective, those habitats are generally within the Humber rather than on the open coast, so not actually relevant to the coastal side of things in East Yorkshire, but that information will help feed into the decision making around the Humber estuary and the priorities for it within the nature recovery strategy. And then the broader survey was similar in terms of numbers. We had good geographic spread across the county, which you can see here. Again, the majority of respondents to this indicated that they lived in the area. So that just means they told us they lived in the area. It doesn't mean that only 62% of respondents actually lived here. It's only 62% told us that they lived here. And likewise, just over 20% indicated that they also worked here. So the colour of the pen indicates the number of responses by ward, I think it was. So green is low density, yellow is mid, orange is slightly higher density, and then red is the highest. So you can see that Hull had the highest density, highest number of respondents for that area, followed by Beverley, Driffield, and as you'd expect, the populated areas. So although the overall total number of respondents is relatively low per head of population, we've got quite good geographic spread. We've cut the map off, but it does extend up into the Flamborough area. And where we've got geographic gaps, it really is those areas of low population density. So there's still work to be done here, but we were quite pleased with the fact that we didn't have any big gaps in coverage and the message got across. And we're particularly pleased that we've got good representation from Hull and the other towns to make sure that the views of urban residents are being captured within this. So just to run through some of the key highlights from this in regards to answers to questions. So what we've got here is the same question, but the results from the general audience survey and the results from the land manager survey on the right. So the same question as before: to what extent are you concerned about the decline of wildlife and biodiversity in Hull and East Yorkshire? The vast majority on both are concerned to some degree. The general audience survey had a higher proportion of respondents who are concerned to a large extent than the land manager survey. But again, I would caveat this with the land manager survey had a much smaller sample size, so the responses of any one individual has a greater impact on that pie chart than it does in the general survey. So we had about 10 times as many people respond to the general survey than we did to the land manager survey. But nonetheless, the vast majority are concerned to some degree around the state of biodiversity within the region. And then this is the summary output of what is a fairly complex analysis based upon the prioritisation process from the different groups for species and habitats. What's interesting here is that the general audience and the land managers, by and large, agree on what is important. So if we start on the left with the species assemblages, you can see that the top two are the same, invertebrates and farmland birds. 3 and 4 just switch. Sorry, no, they don't. Freshwater species is higher within the general audience, whereas at 3rd, whereas it's down at 5th for the land manager. Reptiles and amphibians, interestingly, both at 4th. And then as you go down, it really is just a case of them being ranked ever so slightly differently between the two groups. And then the marine side, interestingly, both scoring poorly compared to the other ones. And then from a habitats perspective, it's identical all the way down, I think, to number 8, where the general audience goes for parks, gardens, cemeteries, etc., whereas land managers consider ponds and then the coastal soft cliffs. So again, because the land manager survey had a lower number of respondents, it could be a reflection of the geography of the respondents. So for example, if we had a high proportion of land managers from the Holderness coast, you'd expect the soft cliffs to maybe be a little bit more front and centre of their thinking with this. But as I said previously, we're waiting for the full analysis of this. This is very much just the headlines. So like I said previously, this is not a be-all and end-all of what the priorities will be in the LNRS, but this well-informed decision-making and well-informed part of the criteria which applies to the shortlisting process for species and habitats. And then the last bit to update you on is the description of the strategy area. So anyone who is in the webinar, the previous webinar we ran, would have seen the graph, which is on my left. So that's the one without the numbers on it. So as part of the LNRS, we thought about how we want to, explain the importance and the uniqueness of the region from an ecological perspective and the perspective of the natural environment. And we decided upon an approach based upon national character areas, which is essentially a categorization of landscapes based upon geology and habitat types. And we tweaked it slightly for our own purposes. But when we presented the graph on the left with the grey block for Hull on it, the feedback we had both from the respondents and participants within the webinar, but also our technical teams and the project teams, was that the way we presented this map makes it look like Hull's not part of this. It looks separate because we blocked it out. So we've taken that away and adjusted the mapping based upon feedback that actually people wanted to see the landscapes represented rather than sort of splitting out specific areas. So the map on the right is a variation of the one which we've had approval within the project teams to use. The only difference will be that we have decided that we will highlight the urban areas on here just with a dotted line around the boundary, so we can see, or the users of the LNRS will be able to see where Hull and the East Riding towns sit within the landscape. We just, that decision was only made on Friday and we just haven't had time to update the map yet. So in terms of describing the area and the approach that we're taking to describing the county, we're sort of breaking things down largely according to national character areas. So we've got the lime green as Yorkshire Wolds, the yellow in the Vale of York, the River Hull as the sort of teal block, Holderness Inland, and the Humberhead levels in the sort of dark green at number 6, and the Humber Estuary. Because of the way that we are managing the coast and the marine element, that 1 kilometre inland to 12 nautical miles offshore, we are including that as a sort of coastal habitat, although obviously it is part of Holderness and is part of the Yorkshire Wolds. It's just for the purposes of developing the LNRS, we've got the same people working on both of those habitats, so it made sense for us to group them together. So this is as a result of feedback from the webinar. So again, thank you to anyone who participated in the first one who contributed to that. And we will have the finalised map ready in a few days, which will reflect the dotted line boundary of Hull, Beverley, Market Wheaton, Hornsey, Bread, etc. Goole. And this will form the basis for how we, I guess, how we describe the area from a biodiversity perspective, but also how we then target some of the actions that are appropriate from a nature recovery perspective based upon habitat type to try and support people's decision making when the LNRS is ready. So that's the end of my talking. Everyone will be more than pleased to hear. There are technical things going on behind the scenes, but we haven't got to the point of having approval on any of them. So they're sort of too early to share at this stage. But one of the next steps that we're going to carry out in the spring will be to start sharing via the commonplace page draft sections of the LNRS and draft outputs from some of the consultation that we've carried out, so that we can get people's views on how things are progressing. So we'll create a document library on the commonplace page with some very, very brief, 1, 2, maybe 3 max questions, surveys, to understand if people agree, disagree with the process as it's evolving, because the timeline doesn't allow us to sort of develop the LNRS to 60, 75%, get people's thoughts, and if people aren't happy, go back and change it all. So we want to try and sort of drip feed that out there to technical groups, but the general public as well, so that we can see how things are progressing and we can almost adapt to feedback on a live basis. So that should be available in the relatively soon, but probably post-Easter, I would say. Which means we can hand over to your good selves for any questions that you might have. So I think if we can start with questions from the Q&A text box, but equally if anyone wants to raise their virtual hand, we can turn on mics and cameras, and I will endeavour to answer the questions as best that I can. Which means we'll also stop recording at this point.